Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first public lecture of Spring 26. I'm Katie Danzhang. I'm a faculty member in architecture and I'm part of the college programming committee. The committee currently includes Faye Nixon, Carlos Strado, and myself. And our former member, Julie Kress, also contributed to the planning of this year's public event series. I'm very excited to introduce you our guest speaker for today, Igor Siddiqui, architect, designer, professor, curator, writer, and traveler. His work explores how architecture and its allied field shape contemporary life through a combination of teaching, writing, and creative practice. He makes objects, materials, images, dioramas, texts, and events with the overarching aim of linking design experimentation to public engagements. Igor is currently an associate professor at University of Texas, Austin, where he has taught since 2009 and has been a program director of the interior design program since 2018. He was awarded the IADA Educator of the Year Award in 2022, which is an award recognizes and celebrates the full-time design educator for outstanding accomplishments and commitment to interior design education. He has served as editor-in-chief, co-editor, and associate editor for the journal Interiors, Design, Architecture, Culture since 2016. And he has contributed numerous essays, chapters, and articles to journals, edited books, and magazines, including an essay titled Jean-Michel Wilmot's Interior Urban Design as a Model for Public Interior Practice in the book Public Interiority, Exploring Interiors in the Public Realm, edited by our very own Liz Teston and published in 2025. Igor regularly lectures and leads workshops nationally and internationally, and his work has been widely exhibited at a range of venues, including the Tallinn Architecture Biennale, the Gallery of Sciences, Science and Technology of the Serbian Academy of Sciences and Arts in Belgrade, Site Santa Fe, Fuchsbox Festival, Metro Show Art Fair, the Ogden Museum of Art, and Flux Factory, to name a few. For this year, our lecture series is themed around historically barriers and barriers historically. The theme was developed by the programming committee, which we used as a prompt to our guests, but more so as a lens through which we search for critical voices in different fields. These two words appeared on the words to avoid list in early 2025. Researchers have been recommended to avoid them when pursuing federal grants, as they can be seen as something of a tell. Alone, these words would seem to be unambiguously apolitical, the stuff of truth and reality. Historically, there have been barriers, and barriers historically have been manifested as elements of architecture and design. We could easily find other words to use, but we insist on the availability of these. We inhibit air, ink, access, form, and weather to define space, create community, contain events, enable progress, print graphics, and protect humanity. As a leading scholar and educator in interior design, Igor challenges the known boundaries between disciplines, as well as the boundary of professional practice. In his forward essay for the book, Digital Fabrication in Interior Design, Body, Object, Enclosure, he writes, here I quote, the space of interior design as a field of knowledge is defined by a soft boundary, pliable, porous, and absorbent. This boundary is designed to encourage productive exchange between its exterior and interior. End quote. From inside to outside, interior to urban space, indoor to outdoor, Igor's work advocates for interiority as a space for experimentation and architecture as a social practice that promotes active engagement. Experimentation and practice are also the key focus of his study of the architect Claude Parent, which we will be learning more from today's lecture. In 2025, Igor published the book Oblique Experiments, titled here, Claude Parent's architecture installations, 1969 to 1975, which is one of the first English language monographs dedicated to the French avant-garde architect, and the first comprehensive study of his experimental interior installations from the 1970s. Mostly known as sloped surfaces setting architecture free from strict distinction between program and circulation, These installations were designed as instruments for imagining and verifying potential of life at oblique angles. And I think we'll learn from Igor's talk today about obliqueness, not only about innovative forms, but also their interrelated events and the realization of them to understand different potentials of architecture as oblique experimental practice. Prior to UT Austin, Igor taught at Parsons, the New School of Design, UPenn, California College of the Arts, Yale, and New York Institute of Technology. He received M.Arch from Yale in 2003 and a B.Arch from Tulane in 1998, where he was taught by Scott Wall. Please join me in welcoming Igor Siddiqui.
It's true. I was taught by Scott Wall back in the day. Thank you for this introduction and for the invitation to be here, Caddy. As I've already said earlier today, I feel very spoiled. I've been here a few times, and it's always a pleasure to be here. And thanks to all of you for being here as well. So my talk today is titled Oblique Experiments, and it's based on my ongoing research that recently became a book. Since it's impossible to present the entire book in 1 hour, I did the calculation and I thought that if I did a reading, it would take 8 hours. I will try to share enough material that I hope will generate a discussion. So please do think of some good questions along the way, and I hope to engage in a discussion afterwards. Like the book, this talk centers around a series of installation designs, as Caddy said, by the French avant-garde architect Claude Parent, produced between 1969 and 1975. The talk has 3 parts. First, I will share some context for the work in question. Then we'll look at the installations themselves. And finally, I will share some reflections on what this work may mean for design practice today. But before I explain why I think this work matters, please allow me to first share just a tiny bit more about myself to help you understand why I'm the one talking to you about this work today. So I would say that there are probably 2 things that excite me and inspire me to work. The first one has to do with the question of all the different ways that one can be an architect. And this is something that probably as an 18-year-old with bleached blonde hair, Scott remembers maybe, that this is something that I was always just really curious about, all the different ways that an architect can be in the world, all the different methods of working and of output. And then the second interest that I feel devoted to is this question of all the different ways that we can think about interiors. And while this emerged just a little bit later in my life, first through practice and then also through teaching and research, this possibility of thinking of interiors as an expanded field is something that I'm equally committed to. And so my creative practice, scholarship, and teaching have enabled me to explore these interests in multiple ways, and these pursuits continue to reveal to me the value of experimentation in our field. And the book, Oblique Experiments, captures the overlap between these 2 questions: how to practice architecture and how to think about interiors. So these 2 images are from the prologue to the book. On the right is a self-portrait, not of Claude Parent, but of the Icelandic artist Sigurdur Gudmundsson from 1975. And in my research, I found this image buried in Claude Parent's archives, and I later learned that he really enjoyed looking at it for obvious reasons. But I kind of thought of it as a way of looking at kind of the architect as a kind of oblique figure, if you will. and a kind of a curious finding in the archive. And then on the left is a pair of sketches by Parent and his exploration of the interior as an oblique condition. So I would say that the book really captures a particular overlap of these two things. So these are the drawing thumbnails of the 9 design schemes I'll talk about tonight. Understanding Parent's long-gone installation designs required engaging them through a mix of research methods. I spent way more time in a few different archives than I ever thought I would. And critical was also approaching them both as an architect and through the lens of interiors. So the architect's design methods, the kind of field measurements, modeling, drawing, enabled the kind of reconstruction, analysis, interpretation of each design in ways that other ways of working are not really able to. But then on the other hand, the lens of interiors allowed me to place this work in a context in which elements beyond architectural form, exhibited art, performances, screenings, graphics, publications, people that are part of the kind of the audiences, various participants, as well as the architect himself, and that all those things could be considered as part of the overall work in ways that a sole focus on architecture may have very well missed. Throughout the talk, you will hear about these installations, the support for all the objects and activities unfolding on and around them. And I will refer to them as practicables from the French word praticable. In French, the word praticable stands for a floor or a platform on which an activity occurs, like a theatrical performance or a gymnastic routine, as a matter of decor or scenography. And this is interesting from the kind of standpoint of interior design. A praticable is also an element that exists three-dimensionally rather than being painted on or depicted through a flat image. And then the adjective form of the word references something passable, like a path, or in another sense, something that is possible to put into practice, as in feasible or achievable. So for Parent, the practicables, with the added C, served as instruments for imagining, questioning, feeling, testing, and verifying the viability of bringing his theoretical ideas into practice. Now, why would this work, produced more than 50 years ago in a different part of the world, matter here today? As I advance through this talk, I invite you to pay attention to 3 particular themes that run throughout. The first one is the ground as an interior condition. This is one of the things that really interested me in this research, the notion that the interior can be defined by the ground as a condition rather than enclosure is not necessarily a new idea, but it's an underexplored one. And the way that I think this shows up in these experiments, I think is particularly interesting, as I hope you will see. The second theme is the role of interiority in experimental architecture. Again, something that drew me to this particular area of research. And then finally, to think about obliqueness beyond form. Beyond their presence in Parent's work, I suggest that these themes allow us to connect to this work from the past in order to imagine building upon it in the future. We can reflect on these 3 themes at the end of the talk when I will expand upon this argument, which is also made in the book. But maybe more than anything, especially for students, but really for all of us, I hope that the talk will transport you to a different time and place whose atmosphere will inspire you here and now. So a little bit more context. So this is the kind of the first part. about Claude Parent. Some of you are familiar with his work. I know there are some fans that were trying to find his long out-of-print books online, and they cost about, $2,000 per book. But Claude Parent, by most measures, was a prolific architect engaged in building-oriented practice with numerous commissions constructed throughout France between the 1950s and really the kind of the end of the 1990s. And these are just 8 of the buildings that I have had the chance to visit myself over the years. In these images, if you kind of look at them from left to right and then top row to bottom row, you will see the kind of stylistic shifts from the late 50s museum modernism that he was inspired by to what we would today refer to as brutalism in the 60s and 70s, to the kind of looser geometries in the later work, especially the last 2 images, which are projects from the 1990s. Parent frequently collaborated with artists, figures like Yves Klein, who he worked with on the concept of air architecture in the late 1950s. And today, if you're on Instagram or Google his work, he's also known for his intricate drawings of imagined architectures. And this part of his practice continued into the 21st century, well after his professional office closed. He drew every day, and this work seems to be getting more and more attention today, which is really wonderful. And the Claude Parent archives in Paris have done a really wonderful job of making sure that these drawings aren't just sitting in a public archive, but instead that this work continues to be circulated publicly in different ways. So here we see the dapper architect in a photo from the mid-1960s. And despite his long career with diverse output, Parent remains best known for his work centered on the theory of the oblique function. If anyone knows anything about his work, they will say, oh yeah, it's the oblique function, which is a theory of the inclined plane in architecture. Parent proposed placing all of life's activities and events on sloped surfaces in lieu of flat ground. So if this is a new idea to you, just let it sink in. In this way, he sought to free architecture of orthogonal form, arguing that this would renew architecture's broader relevance and inspire people's engagement with their built surroundings. He initially formulated these principles in the 1960s, a few years before producing the work I'll focus on in a moment. And he didn't do this alone. Next to Parent, we see Paul Virilio. To those of you interested in theory, you may know Virilio as an influential cultural theorist, urbanist, and philosopher, probably from the 1980s and on. But it is here with Parent that his prolific career as a thinker really started. Parent and Virilio met in '63 and formed Architecture Principe, a practice that was part architecture studio and part avant-garde think tank dedicated almost exclusively to the theory of the oblique function and its potential for application in practice. All they wanted to do was put things on slopes. This was what they did for 6 years. And in this kind of simple diagram from '66, Paul Virilio makes this argument for this oblique order, and this is a diagram that many of you have seen, most likely, which is that obviously the orthogonal order is additive, and the oblique is about multiplicity, right? So this kind of idea about emergence. And the two men came from different backgrounds with the oblique as a kind of overlapping interest. So Virilio, younger of the two, not at all trained as an architect. In fact, he was trained as a master stained glass artist and spent the 50s working on, I believe that he worked on some of the stained glass for Ronchamp But he had this kind of intellectual ambitions of a thought leader, and he was fascinated by World War II bunkers, which he encountered along the French coast and extensively documented starting in the late 50s. And this became the book Bunker Architecture, which many of you know, which was published sometime in the 90s by Princeton Architectural Press. He was interested in the loss of flat ground as a datum for these objects, as well as in their psychological resonance as remnants of war. And then on the left, you really see a photograph of his from this period that exemplifies this type of object-ground relationship. Parent, a decade older with an already established track record as a practicing architect, when they met, arrived at the Oblique by trying to subvert the kind of orthogonal order of his building commissions, mostly single-family houses. He was kind of working on these kind of formal rotations in his work. I love this image on the right because it shows this kind of aspiration of an architecture that doesn't yet exist. You see a house which was built in 58, but staged in a way that kind of anticipates this kind of ground, which is also the roof, which is this kind of publicly navigable surface. So this is how their interest overlapped when they joined forces and decided to work on the oblique function. Combining their different backgrounds and overlapping interests, Parent and Virilio set out to articulate a series of preoccupations centered around the inclined plane. During their time working together, so between 63 and 68-ish, they took on a series of projects from exhibitions and publications to competition entries and also some built commissions. And these three capture not only this range, but also help explain how these artifacts shape Parent's experimental installations that followed. And I will just spend a couple of slides talking about this work. There is a whole chapter dedicated to this kind of prehistory of Parent's experiments. So the three artifacts are a self-published magazine, so a zine, an architecture zine, a built church in the middle, and a scheme for an experimental installation that was never constructed at the end of their partnership. So first, the magazine, and this is one spread from one of the issues. They published all 9 issues throughout 1966 as a kind of self-made venue for disseminating the group's work, a mixture of theoretical provocations, drawings, and in-progress projects. And like many other intellectually ambitious architects engaged in the production of publications at the time, they used the printed medium as a platform for critiquing the present and asserting their visions of the future, right? So this was a kind of not so unusual to form an avant-garde group, establish a zine, and then kind of be a leader or kind of a provocateur about the future. And the Beatrice Colomina's exhibition and later book, Clip Stamp Fold, is a really good example of the kind of culture of printed publications that kind of existed at that time, not only in France, but really internationally. So if the portfolio style format gives Architecture Principe, which is also the title of the magazine, the appearance of design proposals intended to be built, its true power was in provocation. Nope. Yet the magazine revealed that its authors were as serious about their speculative fiction as they were intent on engaging material realities of architectural practice. In other words, they mixed theoretical projects meant to agitate the reader with projects that were meant to be built, right? So the magazine as such captured an underlying conflict between the use of provocative aesthetics as a way of unsettling ways of thinking about reality from the distance offered by mediated images and text on the one hand, And then on the other hand, the desire to reshape reality through practice, through built form. And this also made Architecture Principe a little bit different from groups like Archigram, which they used as inspiration, where they stayed in their own sort of lane without engaging built practice. Parent actually learned about Archigram by editing a special issue of Aujourd'hui, dedicated to Archigram, and soon thereafter they kind of prototyped their own version of a kind of a, let's say, today we would call it a speculative practice. So that's the publication. An example of the built work produced during this period, and also featured in the magazine along with the drawings and text. And the text is quite juicy. I mean, they're really, there's some serious provocations in there about the status quo. Is the Church of Saint Bernadette in Nevers, in central France, and this was Architecture Principe's first built commission and most well-known work. So if you know any buildings by Claude Parent and Virilio, this is the one. Constructed from cast-in-place concrete, its exterior is imposing and heavy, not unlike the bunkers that Virilio studied. Inside, the main space is split in half by a pair of floor slabs. You see it in the image on the left, elevated from the ground and sloping up like two rate stages facing one another. Light and people enter through the middle zone, defined by the meeting of these two inclined planes. So this kind of oblique section that shapes the building's interior, and then this kind of concrete bunker-like shell on the exterior. So at best, the building received mixed reviews when it was built. Parent kind of looked back and referred to as the church that everyone mocked and rejected. And referencing wartime bunkers, it turned out, was a bit premature in the 1960s. So, and building an emerging idea about inclines out of concrete was also a bit too soon. So even if the building, you know, and Frédéric Miguerou, I mean, this building sort of comes back in the 1990s. It's featured in the Venice Biennale in 1996. And so Paul Virilio's reputation as a theorist is relinked to his kind of engagement in architectural practice in the 60s. All of these things happen in the 90s, kind of centered around the church. But in any case, even if the building was proof that what they envisioned through drawings and text could be physically constructed, the architects still lacked sufficient evidence that the public reception of their architecture and the subjective responses by those who experienced it were in line with their own theoretical expectations or assumptions, right? So this turns out to be a problem for them. The gap subsequently prompted Parent and Virilio to develop another instrument of research, or another way to practice, a temporary oblique dwelling for two. And so here are some drawings of this project. Designed in '68, so right before the kind of the protests of May of 1968 started, the installation was conceived as an architectural experiment in which Parent and Virilio were to serve as subjects. They were supposed to live in there for a month. So the design consists of two living units with sloped floors elevated high above the ground. And like I said, they were supposed to live in there for a month side by side. The two of them planned to make living inside the installation their temporary full-time job while adhering to relative isolation from the outside world. They also intended to place themselves under the observation of physicians, psychologists, and sociologists while inhabiting the installation. So through this project, they tried to further engage with the kind of behavioral aspects of architecture, exploring how spatial consequences of oblique form needed to be precisely calibrated to the people that he tried to engage. The installation was thus an attempt to mitigate the kind of presumptuousness of architectural representation, right? The conviction that once it is resolved on paper, a work of architecture must already be worthy of physical manifestation. So as a whole, the project was meant to combine aspects of architectural installation, durational performance, and also a kind of evidence-based research, and can in this way be seen as a seed of a hybrid form of practice from which Parent's later experiments would grow, as you'll see. Critically, it marked a kind of reorientation toward experimentation that took place not on paper, but rather somewhere inside, focusing on the alignment of two forms of interiority, interior space and subjective experience. So the body of work that we just looked at as kind of exemplified by these three projects demonstrates that drawings and words were not enough, yet that building was in a sense too much. Installation was an experimental method, on the other hand, offering a kind of new potential. So after parting ways with Virilio, they essentially had a breakup over political differences during the events in 1968. After parting ways with Virilio, Parent held on to this insight and made use of it moving forward. So following the split with his partner, Parent published an updated manifesto, this time on his own, Vivre à l'oblique, which translates, as you can imagine, to oblique living, something like oblique living. And actually, this is one of the books that are quite central to understanding these experiments, but even though it's been translated to several languages, it has never been, at least not so far, been translated to English. But in this book, instead of presenting oblique architecture as an autonomously conceived vision, either ready to be implemented or so radical that it's not meant to be built, Parent proposes living on the oblique as a potential outcome dependent upon the participation and feedback of those willing to engage it. So the book calls for, quote, and these are translations made with my recently mastered French, individual participation in the act of building, promoting a form of joint authorship between architects and the public. So instead of a provocation, the oblique function is presented as a hypothesis in need of evidence. So really, this is what I'm trying to track, this kind of difference between provocation and hypothesis, and a kind of hypothesis as a precondition for these experiments. The book invites reimagining the ground as an architectural construct at the scale of the body and the scale of the city. So very quickly, these are two spreads from the book. So on the upper left, you see the oblique function as it applies to the scale of the city. So the notion that inclines could sectionally reorganize cities, breaking away from the figure ground logic of distributing the inside and the outside, or what Parent throughout the text refers to as the difference between circulation and habitation. This isn't entirely unlike what Peter Eisenman described in the 1990s in his short essay, Unfolding Events, if any of you remember it from that time. And on the right, he addresses the scale of the body with the incline as a generator for a kind of a dynamic engagement with one's environment. He thought of, or the way that Parent writes about a body on an incline is that one's internal motor gets activated. The idea was that architecture that instigates movement was better suited to contemporary life than conventional orthogonal forms, including flat ground, which he thought was way too static and outdated. So he used the book as a theoretical script, according to which his oblique experiments would be enacted during this period that we're just finally getting to. So now I get to what I refer to as the tour. This is the second part of the talk. And in the book, and I can show it to you later, it's the middle pink chapter, which is the kind of the core of the book. So a series of experimental installations were designed one after another, part of what I refer to in the book as the Tour de France. So the tour unfolded across a network of maisons de la culture, or houses of culture. And these were state-financed institutions that were established to decentralize French culture outside of Paris. And so in the map of France, you see Paris in white. This is where Parent was coming from. And now he's trying to tour with this idea of the oblique function throughout provincial France. And so if you can see the dots, so all the cities are cities that he visited during the tour, exhibiting this work, talking about this work. And then the magenta dots are cities where the installations were built. The cyan or the blue dots are cities that had installations designed for but not entirely built. And then the yellow ones were where he visited and did a number of programs, but there's no evidence of an installation. So this is also like a part of the detective work because no one else had kind of put this together before. Even his family was quite unsure of how much of this work had previously existed. So, so this is what took so long, kind of finding evidence and then kind of situating it, and then kind of making sense of it. So these, going back to the Maison de la Culture, so they're cultural centers that basically, it was an initiative from the late 1950s. So this is the, if it means anything to you, it's the Charles de Gaulle era between 1959 and 1968. It's a part of the kind of nation-building project, and as a kind of competitive edge strategy for French as a nation was to kind of share the wealth of culture kind of beyond the capital, with quite a kind of a capital C and capital A idea of what is culture and what is art. But these multi-use complexes hosted performances, exhibitions, and other arts-oriented public programs, as you see on the map, throughout provincial France. But then following 1968 and the kind of the political unrest in France and elsewhere, they faced pressure to expand their audiences through kind of beyond their kind of capital A art and high culture, kind of inviting these new forms of participatory programming as a kind of way for these institutions to better connect to the audiences that they're meant to serve. So for Parent, these cultural centers provided, they were venues for his experiments, they provided budget, staff, and a kind of institutional mission that aligned with his own experimental objectives. So a really opportunistic kind of alignment with shifting institutional priorities after this kind of political moment, and also his kind of drive to get a better sense of whether his crazy ideas are applicable in practice. And so this network of institutions allowed him to test oblique living across multiple sites and audiences. Each practicable was tailored to host, to its particular host institution and accompanying programs. So part of drawing each of these and kind of developing a narrative based on archival materials was to try to see what that itinerary was and also to compare them to one another. So these installations varied in configuration. Some were elaborate, multi-leveled constructions. Others relatively simple inclined planes. And it turns out that their design responded to the specificities of each site, the available space within existing buildings, the nature of scheduled events, and what local resources they could support. The practicables were instruments for observing how people responded to inclined planes. On the left, On the left, you see Claude Parent testing different inclines as a part of the design process. On the right, you see him kind of sitting in the audience, trying to study, pardon me, trying to study what was happening. Parent describes experimentation in his 1975 memoir. Quote, "Who experiments? People, the population, the crowd, the person who sets foot on these inclined planes. Who makes experimental architecture? The architect who combines these inclined planes into a deliberate strategy of space to enable others to feel." So this is his kind of conceptualization of what is an experiment. So he worked with a recurring set of collaborators whom he referred to as his troupe, developing programs that helped, quote unquote, activate the installations and the audience. Among the group was a writer and his co-producer who orchestrated much of the tour, the painter André Belaguet, whose work we will see in a moment, a sculptor, a choreographer, a photographer, even a mime performer. These productions were collaborative, with each stop featuring different local partners, artists, cultural administrators, workshop leaders, alongside the traveling ensemble. So the first destination was the Norman city of Le Havre, and this is the first of these 9 experiments that the book looks at, from 1969. The installation was Parent's first realized attempt at applying principles of the oblique function in practice since the 1966 completion of the church in Nevers, which you remember. And this was really the beginning of this tour and the period of experimentation through the production of ephemeral events and installations. And then this drawing that I made is the first example of how I reconstructed Parent's work based on various existing materials, so that different installations could be better understood in relation to their context and compared to one another. There is very little evidence in any of the existing materials that these were truly site-specific installations, and kind of modeling them and drawing them in relation to the buildings that hosted them was really, really important. And so this is the Maison de la Culture in Le Havre. This was actually the first Maison de la Culture that opened as a part of this national rollout. It has this really beautifully detailed, curtain wall detailed by Jean Prouvé. This vast kind of gallery space with high ceilings, and a curtain wall that faces the sea, which actually became a part of the way that the installation was sited, that I'll talk about in a moment. And then in the existing drawings, you understand that in this case, the oblique installation was an experiment, but really it was kind of exhibition design used as an experiment, because Parent was actually tasked with do an exhibition design, and he designed the ramp instead. But the ramp then organized, as you can see from some of these sketches, was able to organize the exhibition in a particular way. It was a kind of a 3-part organization. So this drawing already reveals how Parent's installation, which the press called a gigantic and unusual wooden construction, related to the glass and steel architecture of the museum. So you kind of see the installation was 35 meters long, so times 3 will give you the feet, and 5 meters wide, and kind of parallel to the curtain wall. So its salient feature was a wide, moderately steep ramp leading up to a landing more than 2 meters above the existing floor level, so kind of to the 2nd floor, and then narrower, shorter, and steeper sloped surfaces provided kind of alternative routes for going up and down. And the yellow stripe running down the middle gave the main slope kind of a road-like appearance. This is the only time that something like this appears on the tour, but like a sliver of painted scenography conveying a fictional exterior. And the press kind of said that the visitor was purely and simply transformed into a pedestrian of the year 2000, who sees houses and cities transformed into itineraries full of fantasies and freedom. But in relation to the context, the installation was far from indifferent. The design enhanced the existing setting rather than transforming it beyond recognition. A kind of assertive architecture that was also sympathetic to its surroundings, which is quite different from the kind of the attitude of the kind of work from the 60s. So rising above the gallery floor, the inclined planes took advantage of the available volume of space in a way that not only served the specific interest of the exhibition, but also accentuated the verticality and is such enhancing rather than negating the existing architecture. This was another sort of insight. It was kind of getting a better sense of what the attitude of these installations was relative to the kind of architecture that supported them. So, and then, you know, one of the things that I learned through field work and this kind of reconstruction through modeling and drawing was that by setting the installation parallel to the vast curtain wall overlooking the sea, the installation's oblique slopes were actually juxtaposed against the flatness of the horizon beyond, which is really, there's no picture of it, it doesn't exist, but when you kind of place the model in sight, you understand that this is what's really happening, putting onto the display the difference between the normative datum of the horizon and the skewed orientation of Parent's oblique architecture. And this is, let's say, one of the kind of insights of doing this research from the perspective of a designer through kind of design methods. And, you know, I just really enjoyed the kind of absolutely obsessive attitude about obliqueness so much that even a flyer could actually be transformed to make a miniature ramp. And referencing the installation at the end of his curatorial statement, he calls the installation une expérimentation implicite, like an implicit experiment, which is kind of an interesting way to think about what this work is. You know, as you know, in French, the phrase can refer, the kind of expérimentation can be an experiment, an experience, or experimentation. And so this kind of meaning shifts depending on one's relationship to the practicable as an object. For the architect, the kind of the author, it can be seen as an experiment whose implicit aims have not yet been fully revealed, so somehow kind of an oblique or a kind of ulterior motive. And for the users of the ramp, it can be an experience whose occurrence is not entirely conscious, like a minor background event. I mean, what's the big deal of being on a ramp? We probably do it all the time. And in this way, the user's experience is the architect's experiment, a relationship that Parent further articulated in Vivre à l'Oblique, the book that was published the same year. So the dynamic of people engaging the ramp and the architect observing the interaction is one of the several aspects of what throughout the subsequent tour constituted participation and research. It was one method, in other words, of producing and gathering evidence in support of his hypothesis. This is the one sort of detour in the tour outside of France. So Parent participated in the 1970 Venice Biennale as a curator, and again with ulterior motives. He signs up to be the curator of the French Pavilion to make an oblique installation. And this appearance in Venice also turned out to be an important model for subsequent stops along the tour. For Parent, this was really, and he said it many years later, that to him this was really the first fully realized manifestation of oblique space. With this installation, he really thought okay, I'm really getting closer to being able to kind of activate a space through this kind of diagonal geometry in a way where people are engaging it in line with what I'm hoping for. So at the French Pavilion in the Giardini in Venice, Parent used the practicable also as a kind of assertive element capable of transforming existing architecture. And in a review of the exhibition, the critic referred to the installation as the phenomenon of cannibalization of one space by another. I think it was more than that. And here you see the front facade of the French Pavilion, kind of a 1912 neoclassical structure with the kind of front loggia and the columns, and then inside mayhem. The installation was designed so that when you get to the front door, you are on a crease, right? So already the kind of threshold is disrupted from this kind of normal or kind of normative way of entering the building. You're kind of seeing him in the background saying, it should be like that, more oblique. It's like more cowbell. And you see the model here of the interior. So the slopes were as high as 30 degrees, so a mixture of 15-degree and 30-degree slopes, but without necessarily a single prescribed path. So if you think about the previous installation with these kind of vectors of movement that were more or less predetermined, this installation was kind of designed so that you could circulate it in different ways. And the models that were built as a part of the design process also kind of captured the aesthetic of the space constructed at full scale. These are some of Parent's drawings. So one of the things that you will see throughout this tour is that some of the installations were documented through drawings, some of them only through photographs, some of them through models that were photographed but then destroyed. So all of that was kind of a part of kind of reconstruction and filling in the gaps. So what he did here as a curator is he proposed the installation as a curatorial strategy. And you can think of it as a curatorial brief delivered as an architectural object. So he referred to the model as an opening statement, not a final word. And he kind of became a curator of the pavilion because no one else wanted to be in that role after 1968. These institutional spaces, like no one wanted to touch them, like no one was going to no one from the art world was going to curate the biennial exhibition. It was the first, biennial Venice Biennale after the events in 1968. So of course he wanted to do it. But he himself said that he wouldn't really know how to organize an exhibition, that all he could do as an architect was to design a space and then see what artists might do with it. So there was no kind of conventional placement or artwork or kind of commissioning. So, he said, and this is kind of, he recalled this assignment. He said, transform it as you wish, speaking to the artists, according to your sensibility. Work together, one with the other, one against the other, appreciating or hating each other in order to humanize this purely geometric form. So again, he used this kind of architectural form as a prompt to figure out something else, as a kind of spatial framework for this kind of relational, site-specific artistic response. This is one of the images that really made me want to write about this work because it happened 50 years ago, but there are parts of it that seem quite contemporary in some ways. Here you see the pretty roughly constructed wood planks at different angles. The ceiling grid, it's a neon grid by the artist François Morellet. The interesting thing about the grid is that it would change color based on people's interaction with it. When I earlier referred to the interior as a kind of framework capable of registering all of these things, elements beyond architecture, I was talking about things like balloons. These were actually a part of the installation proposed by the painter André Belaguet, who also painted the area in the back in red and blue as a way of further kind of complicated this relationship between horizontals and verticals, but also between three-dimensional and kind of two-dimensional surfaces. And so, obviously, for Parent, one of the most gratifying things was having this environment inhabited, so that he could finally get some of this feedback. One artist that didn't play well with the others is Samuel Burry, who is a Swiss painter. So instead of playing with the other artists, he had his own hallway off to the right. So you see some of those paintings, so that was the exception. And so the idea was that the physical form was first proposed by the architect, completed by artists, and then came to life through visitor, with the idea that in this kind of stage-like setting, everyone was both performer and audience. And unlike the previous installation that you saw, this one was not really an autonomous object that you could kind of grasp by being outside of it in its entirety, but is rather discovered through movement. And in this way, it almost seems as if the existing architecture kind of crops this otherwise expanded territory, almost as if it were a kind of a swatch of a larger condition, or a kind of the pavilion as a kind of opaque petri dish, as a kind of experiment that this is just a sample of. You see Samuel Burry's introverted hallway of paintings on the right. And so Parent referred to this installation as embryonic, a seed that will open up a whole world. So at this point, he had quite a bit of optimism, but we'll see that shift and just give him 5 more years. So the next one was in Nevers the following year. This is, if you remember, the city where his church was built. So he returns to the city of Nevers 5 years after he finished building the church with Virilio. So this installation happened at a cultural center, a part of the program, and this is where we really see the tour sort of come to life through both architecture, but also related exhibitions and other programs. He spent the entire summer working with the local population in Nevers, staging workshops and talking about architecture. I mean, one of the things that's maybe interesting to mention is that he was one of the only influential architects who never had a teaching job. So he actually didn't have a platform for talking about these ideas in a way that others did. So when these kind of workshops and lectures and publications that came out of it, as you'll see in a moment, come out, kind of understand it was almost a kind of alternative pedagogy that kind of existed outside of the kind of institutions. And so for this reconstruction, there were no drawings, no models, but there were pretty good photographs, and then through field work, it was pretty obvious how the installation kind of snaked around existing conditions. So it's basically these sort of two inclines organized around a common landing. And you see here the Maison de la Culture in Nevers and the space where the installation took place. And in this case, if the first couple of installations existed in the context of an exhibition, here it was really sort of built for its own sake. It didn't support another exhibition. It was not a part of any sort of curatorial strategies. It was really about an architectural installation for the sake of kind of a public experience. And so here you see how the installation responds to existing stairs, the existing geometry of the enclosures, and also its kind of appearance as a kind of extra large painting. So André Belaguet, who already appeared in Venice, paints the installation, and when you're in this space, you actually understand that most of the views of the installation would have happened from the mezzanine. So there was kind of a way to look at the installation and people on it as if it were this kind of inhabited painting. Some early 70s fashion. And so again, this is interesting because it doesn't really have the function of scenography or curatorial strategy, but it's kind of an architectural experiment kind of staged on its own terms. I should also say that all of this installation in particular, but some of the other ones as well, were built by municipal workers using existing scaffolding and wood planks that kind of came out of kind of municipal works and kind of returned afterwards. And, for some time I thought, well, these are so kind of DIY, and I sort of understood that was actually a part of the methodology, a part of the accessibility, almost thinking of these installations as if they were sketches, right? As a way of presenting an architecture that was open-ended, all the things that the church was not, right? So you kind of see the kind of cultural production, and again to kind of to return to the site of the church, to the city where the church was built. Parent speaks to the press and said, "I'm not an avant-garde architect," and this is a really important kind of strategy to try to accomplish something that his previous work had not. And so in this way, the kind of the ordinary nature of the construction is also a part of that attitude. So throughout the summer, or throughout June of 1971, there are a series of lectures that he holds with people that know very little about architecture except for their own kind of lived experience. And these lectures become a part of one of his kind of key books, 5 Reflections on Architecture. And so this also becomes a way for these public institutions charged with public programming to publish his books, which is kind of clever and much more efficient than printing your own zine. So the fourth installation, and this is arguably the tour's peak in terms of scope and activity, happened in Amiens, which is in the Picardy region of France, in northern France. And it's pretty extraordinary for a number of reasons. It's this kind of funnel-like amphitheater that's sited between the front facade of the building, but on the second level, and you'll kind of see images of it to kind of understand its kind of public facing appearance, and the way in which the installation tries to be both architecture and furniture in a way. This is the Maison de la Culture in Amiens. This was a kind of a key cultural center at the time because it was actually the first cultural center in France that was actually built according to the kind of state plan for these institutions. So it was heavily oriented toward performing arts. It had 2 theaters. It still does. It kind of had this ugly makeover about 20 years ago. So you kind of see this kind of shell. But otherwise, it still functions in the same way. And so the kind of the geometry and the form of Parent's installation was very much kind of in the spirit of performing arts. And again, you kind of see the cultural production of posters and publications and all of these kind of artifacts that were meant to bring architecture to a popular audience, right? These were not shows for other architects. We're not in Paris anymore. So this kind of, and you see the installation here as seen from the outside through the window. This is one half of it through one of the 2 windows. The kind of idea that the installation was this kind of balcony overlooking the city, and all aspects of it were publicly accessible and on display, including the ongoing construction during the first weeks of his residency there. So the kind of going up of the scaffolding, the wood, the painting, and all of that. And along the kind of the public programs that talked about architecture, there were curated exhibitions, and in the background you see the paintings by the same artist that had painted the previous installations, including this one. So if you look more closely, you will see that it's actually a composition of kind of orange, red, brown, and yellow. So this installation also shows up as a kind of inhabitable painting. But a part of the story here also, and this goes back to kind of understanding his conceptualization of the interior, was that the paintings in this show, or shown as a part of the installation, were produced in an oblique apartment that he had designed in Paris. And so it was a way to kind of bring the kind of oblique domestic interior, and I won't talk too much, I won't talk at all about these 2 domestic interiors, but they are in the book. But they're important to understand these installations because you see that this is the domestic environment that's designed the year before. And so the idea, so this is André Belaguet's apartment. So the same painter that collaborates with him is the client for this apartment. And then the apartment becomes an artifact that is documented and re-exhibited in these exhibitions as a way of bringing the kind of oblique domestic interior into the public. And this kind of notion that all you really need in these environments is art and architecture because the rest has been evacuated and kind of rejected by the slope. In the book, you can kind of learn more about the slope as a way of preventing people from accumulating things in their domestic environments. It was kind of his architectural tool against consumption, but what was privileged instead was this sort of art making. Also exhibited during these months of residencies were paintings by Roberto Matta. So Roberto Matta is Gordon Matta Clark's father, the Chilean surrealist painter. And it's interesting to think about this show happening in France of Roberto Matta's art at the same time when Gordon Matta Clark was taking over the New York art world. So there's just some interesting resonances in these kind of worlds of art and architecture. And in this picture, we see again the dapper architect as a kind of performer in his own work, and on the left, the artist Roberto Matta being filmed on Super 8 or something like that. See some pictures here, again, this kind of notion that the construction of these installations is visible to the public and a part of the kind of performance. Okay, so I'll show a few of these a little bit more quickly. The next one was in Mâcon, which is in the sort of in Burgundy from 73. This was an interesting one. This was an installation that wasn't realized, but it's actually important because it was the first installation that turned out, I learned in my research, was a response to a program. So this installation was fitted to a children's reading room in a public library. And this was one of the socialist-led cities in Burgundy that refused to have a state-funded cultural center because they thought that first they had to deal with literacy, so they built a library instead. So you also kind of see how these installations exist in slightly different contexts depending on the kind of political and social values of different regions. And this one kind of took me a long time to kind of situate in a specific place, but I realized that actually the installation was incredibly sympathetic to kids. If you look at the previous slide, in the space on the left, the windowsill is like way above kids' height, and so the installation actually kind of scales down the environment for kids. And so for this one, this is an unbuilt one, and this is really the only artifact that exists as a single model, even though he spent a lot of time in Mâcon producing exhibitions, talk, and all of these other things like performances. So a lot of these things happened in these cities, even if the program didn't yield an installation. The next one is in Douai, again, in the north of France. This is the only kind of outdoor practicable, and it was a response to a specific institutional sort of context, because this was one of the cities where there was no cultural center. The cultural center was embedded within the city hall. And so in a way, the installation becomes this kind of extension of the cultural center that doesn't have its own building. So it was sited on a public plaza. This is a picture from a couple of years ago, but at the time, it still had kind of traffic circulating through it. You can see from some of the existing drawings that it really was a kind of intervention within the kind of street. You see the curb cuts. And that was really the idea, is that it was to, as you see from the posters, it was to live on the oblique and also to occupy the street. You'll see from some of the other flyers that was kind of the theme of these kind of public programs, with the idea that this was an experimental space where people could encounter the oblique. I mean, again, this is extraordinary if you think about these things existing outside of the world of architecture. Like, none of this was connected. This was not for other architects. This was not for architecture students. These are provincial towns. So again, we see the architect kind of performing the role of the kind of the public architect, engaging the audience, and then his kind of troupe of performance and collaborators. This is one of the instances where the gymnastics routine gets performed. You see other things in the corner. So this is one of these kind of collaborative events, and the praticable was just a part of it. You see the mime here. But it's kind of extraordinary to think that the subject matter of this kind of public program is architecture in and of itself. So also in Burgundy, another one from 73, this is a scheme that wasn't built. This is actually an interesting scheme because it's the only one that goes from inside to outside, and the idea was that the interior would be built first, and then the exterior would be built after that. You see these sort of late 60s brutalist buildings And in many cases, what I discovered was that what he was actually proposing in some of these buildings was to alleviate some of the problems that the buildings posed, almost as if it were kind of a critique of existing architecture. And in fact, most of these buildings have been renovated since the early 70s, and they more or less solved the problems that he picked up on 40 years later. You kind of see the extent of his public programs and the kind of idea that both the architecture and the architect kind of serve as this kind of intermediaries between the institution and the public. This is one of the kind of nicest drawings, kind of composite drawings that kind of shows these particular plans, even if it didn't get built. And so you kind of see these different schemes adapting to different conditions. This is actually the only one that there's not a specific site or city indicated. But based on my research and from the drawings themselves, you can tell that it was meant to be this kind of fitting of an interior space, something like a classroom. And so from the scale, you kind of see that it's not really made for children. And then in some of the writings, it seems like it could have been one of the classrooms retrofitted in a public school, also in Macon, but I don't have a confirmation for that. And then this is the last one. You're seeing, as we move through the series, you see that the installations are not getting built anymore, and it's because the institutions are not caring as much anymore about participation, right? And so after a few years of sort of being proactive about engaging the public, both the administrative will and the funding for it kind of peters out. And in the book, I explain, it's the second chapter of the book, I explain this kind of overlap between this kind of overall narrative of the tour and what was happening kind of politically and socially at that period. Kind of come to the end of the Georges Pompidou term, which was quite good for the arts. And this is the final one. This is one of my favorite ones. It's the only one that's truly a multi-level one. It's also a clever experiment. You'll see in the, so this is a scheme for another city in Normandy, in Caen in this case. And it's kind of intertwined with existing circulation. And Claude Parent was really clever because he juxtaposed these ramps against the stairs because he wanted to figure out, he tried to compare whether people would rather take stairs or ramps. So he actually, and you kind of see the existing site. And again, this happens in this kind of oversized foyer. This is one of the examples where, like 40 years later, the institution is using the foyer as a performance space, which is what he proposed in 75 to begin with. And so, yeah, it actually turns out that what is kind of legible in this model, which seems like an installation, a freestanding installation, is actually this kind of intertwined scheme between existing circulation and new oblique circulation. And then this is the last project. As it peters out, he tries to do different schemes of it so that it could be implemented in other conditions. Kind of interesting to kind of think about. On the right, for example, is the solution for how to integrate railings into the scheme without making railings, which many of us can sympathize with. You can see the kind of labor of really trying to make these things happen. Yeah. The tour ends when the money runs out. So now I just wanted to come back to the third part and the three things that I hope you've been kind of thinking about, which is the kind of reflecting on the ground as an interior condition, the interiority in experimental architecture, and obliqueness beyond form. In the final chapter of the book, I kind of address each of these prompts. So I'll just start with the ground as an interior condition, which we can interpret and engage with in many different ways. What I argue throughout the book is that the power of the oblique function is not in any of us wanting to live on inclines, yet there is this really powerful kind of potential of engaging the ground as an interior specific condition. And so what I reflect on is some of the ways in which what seems like redundancy in these installations, sort of architecture inside architecture, floors on top of floors, is actually a particular strategy to disrupt what one might think of as this kind of hierarchical layering of elements in the ground, right? If you think about kind of a wall section going through a building, you can see this kind of striation of disciplines, with the interior being the kind of the finished layer on the inside. And so this image tries to capture that. In one sense, you can imagine that the interior has the autonomy to make its own floor, but I think it's more than that. I think it's engaging in this kind of stratification of layers in a way that we've thought a lot about in terms of enclosure, but not in terms of the ground. And so I like looking at these probes by the Lebanese artists Joanna Hadji-Thomas and Khalil George, who drilled these kind of time capsules, these probes in different cities to understand this kind of layering of culture in cities that, of course, the interior participates in. And I think that artists have done a better job of dealing with this so far than architects or interior designers. This is a project that we look at quite often. Oliver Eliasson has read Vivre à l'Oblique, and I know that he's engaged some of these ideas, but the form is less important than this kind of organization of material and how this organization of material relates to contemporary conditions, whether they have to do with ecology or extraction or any number of issues that we're all thinking about all the time. Claude Parent produced his work in a profoundly flawed idea that humans are at the center of design, right? This even came up earlier today. This is another project. It's the scenery for the Sun and Sea opera, first presented at the Venice Biennale, where this kind of experience of the Anthropocene is like profoundly linked to the nature of the ground, which also happens to be an interior condition. So we've talked a lot about transparency. It's been like 25 years since Robin Drips wrote the article about the need to have a theory of the ground in architecture if we're going to be serious about connecting the inside and outside. And I think that these are other prompts that are sort of coming up from the perspective of the interior. Or the work of Pierre Hoig, as we're thinking about construction, but also removal, and also thinking about the ground as a condition inhabited not only by humans, but also by multiple species, technologies, and all these other layers that are a part of our habitats. We could talk a lot about the kind of the role and the place of the interior in experimental architecture. It's obvious, of course, these installations happen inside buildings, therefore they're interior. But this interiority is also subjective, and it's not only the people inhabiting, it's also the architect. One of the amazing things about these installations is the question of, like, what does it mean for the architect to be in their own work? Of course, if we look at the work of Coop Himmelblau or Hans Holbein and all the kind of crazy Austrians from the 70s, they put themselves in their own work for various reasons. In art, of course, another slope with the kind of artist present is Vito Acconci. It happened at the same time, just in a different place for very different reasons. And this kind of notion of the designer placing themselves, this is Lucy McRae's work, this is Alex Schwetter's work. I mean, I think it's easy to scaffold upon this project by Alex Schwetter because it's literally the kind of oblique dwelling that Parent and Virilio never got to build. But I think what's specific about these projects is that Parent was actually there as an author so he could give the authorship of those constructions away to the user. And so this kind of notion of this kind of exchange between the author and the user is really interesting. In his writings, what comes up a lot during this period is the kind of the need for one to make their own space. I think what's interesting about it from the perspective of the interior is that interior, like in art, people make their own space all the time. And so it's incredibly interesting to think about how this notion also destabilizes our ideas about architecture and who makes it and who it's for. And finally, I'll just end with the kind of thing that motivated this whole project is to think about obliqueness beyond form, this kind of hunch that obliqueness as a kind of way of working might be a kind of theory of experimental practice in its own right. This is just one image. I had to sneak it in somewhere. This is Claude Parent's oblique apartment, which he lived in with his family between 1975 and 1996. So you can't say that he wasn't committed to the idea. But this kind of commitment to kind of obliqueness as a way of being in the world shows up across other disciplines. No one had yet made the connection between Brian Eno's oblique strategies and Claude Parent's oblique architecture, when in fact they happen at the same time, and they both are forms of lateral thinking, right? Just in a very different way. As a kind of way of being in the world, obliqueness, or obliquity in this case, comes up in economics. John Kay, the economist John Kay, has written about it. It shows up in queer theory. And so I think what's maybe interesting is to begin to think about this kind of notion of obliqueness that is about performance rather than geometry. And I think probably one of the most rewarding things about this research was kind of finding in Parent's writing, especially his kind of late texts that sort of happened late in his career, is this kind of validation of the hunch that he actually thought about obliqueness as a way of being in the world. So these are the 13 subversive acts against the system, where he's trying to be hardcore. He's talking to students. And this kind of like living obliquely certainly wasn't limited to living on the slope. And then finally, I would say that this notion that obliqueness is a kind of way of having ulterior motives in your work, I would say that what makes a design practice experimental is that it has an ulterior motive embedded within it. And then just one last thing, I made a promise that every time I give a talk, I would say something different at the end, just as a way of just continuing to think about it. So this is the last slide, or the second to last slide. So it took Parent 5 years to do this tour, which is how long it took me to write this book about the thing that he did. And we're actually the same age during this 5-year period. He started the tour after the unrest of 1968. I started writing the book after the Black Lives Matter movement really sort of proliferated throughout our country. And so on the left, you see the streets of the Latin Quarter and the kind of the activist slogan, sous les pavés, la plage, so under the pavers is the beach. Again, this kind of notion that the excavation of the ground holds hope in it. And on the right, we see the Texas Capitol. with the Black Lives Matter sign as a way of claiming the ground as a kind of interior condition. And in both cases, 5 years later, the things and the kind of promises that these movements brought are sort of petering out. But I wanted to bring it up because this kind of disappearance of institutional support and interest 50 years apart, I think is interesting to reflect upon. So things that may seem like they're sort of going away or have gone away, we as designers play the role in deciding what comes back and how it comes back. And so engaging what happened in the past from the perspective of design practice allows us to decide which lineage to build upon, engaging in what Beatriz Colomina refers to in her book Manifesto Architecture as building new manifestos from the old ones. This is the QR code for the book, if you're interested in checking it out. Thank you so much.
Ready questions? Wait for the mic. I'm the mic manager today. That's the most important role of me performing. So, wait. Yes.
Hello. Thank you for giving this lecture. This is very engaging. I thought it was really interesting, like the kind of like free flow movement of like circulation, as well as like the just kind of like anti-establishment like feelings that was kind of like held by Parent. I'm kind of curious, is there any documentation of him like shredding a half pipe or like popping a wheelie or like hitting a kickflip over a gnarly gap or anything like that?
I don't have any pictures of that, so that you won't find in the book. Oh. But this question has come up before, and I think the way that I was describing coming across this work, because I was educated in the 90s at the height of the kind of continuous surface project. In fact, and Scott will remember this, it's like you would have these continuous surface projects, but then you couldn't really program it, and so you would just like put a scale figure of a skater on it as a way of showing that it's in fact usable. And so I don't have any pictures of that, but I share with you this kind of interest in this way of thinking about it. And, many of these pictures that I kind of found from 50 years ago felt a little bit like, finding like a cousin whose DNA you aligned with, even though you didn't know that they existed before that. So yeah, I haven't, but I understand your question, and I wish that I had.
Yeah, you're after.
Hey, thank you so much for the talk. This is kind of a question broader for the research and kind of your method about picking who you want to investigate. Do you pick somebody that you appreciated, or did you learn to appreciate them as you research them?
That's a really great question. I think I was interested in the work. I was very lucky. I wasn't so lucky in that I started this research after Claude Parent died. I was very lucky that I got to know his family really well. And so I feel like I learned to really like this person through his family because they're wonderful people. The reason why I wanted to do this research is that I was so surprised that for a project that seems to be so formally in line with how we've thought about certain aspects of architecture for the last 30 years, there's not so much scholarship on it in English, right? Or that what existed was always this kind of one-liner about like being on the slope, right? And I believe that there was a kind of potential in the work that it was more than a one-liner. And so I suppose and then at some point I felt like what was interesting about this particular part of his work is this kind of reconstruction, and I couldn't really imagine that anyone else would do it. So I felt like I really wanted to do it because I had the obsession and the kind of I wanted to do it because I felt like I could, and that I'm not a historian, right? So there are many things from the past that I would look at as a designer, but maybe I wouldn't take on further. But I felt like this was a project that I could take on from the kind of design perspective, and that I could think of it in a way or do something with it in a way that was generative as a part of my design practice. I still think that this is kind of a design project for me, even though it's maybe doing some other work in the world, hopefully.
Thank you so much for the talk, Igor. So you talked about the implications kind of for just being subversive, like why you'd use the oblique, but you also said that when he was going to do the installation that didn't get built in the end, that there were kind of doctors on call and maybe like psychiatrists on call for like to study him. Mm-hmm. So was there a kind of hypothesis about real implications that it would have living on the oblique?
I think that that's what they wanted to find out. I think that there was this, I think, the interesting thing about the development of the theory and the construction, the design and the construction of the church is that they actually happen at the same time, right? If there is this, you could misunderstand that the theory existed before the church, and that the church was the application of the theory. In fact, the construction documents for the church were being drawn at the same time that they were trying to formulate a theory, right? And so they publish frantically 9 issues of one zine at the same time as the church was being completed, kind of anticipating that this kind of convergence of theoretical text and a build commission, that this would actually give them a voice. But it actually turned out that they kind of canceled each other out. But I think they cared about the ideas and were maybe, I don't know, I'm not them. But it seems like in the writing you find this kind of disappointment, right? And this kind of admission that maybe we didn't know enough. I think that this wanting to work with sociologists and doctors, I think that must have come from Virilio, because he was really interested, and you've read Virilio, I'm sure. Maybe Claude Parent he didn't just want to build things, but he was an architect in a way that Virilio wasn't. So they worked on this together, but I think a part of it was also to work in an interdisciplinary way as a way of learning a little bit more about their aspirations and the effect of those aspirations.
So, is it fair to say the hypothesis was just that like life would be different one way or another?
Yeah. I think that it would be different, and I think that when Parent talks about his grandson growing up on the oblique, and when the grandson talks about the memories of being in his grandfather's house, they're profoundly positive stories, and so I think the hope, was that there would be evidence that this was good, right? That you would there is the Byers-Cleave house by Arakawa Gins. I don't know if you all know this project, but this is a project by, it shows up in the book. It's a house on Long Island by a pair of artists who also used the kind of the incline, and the kind of their theoretical concept was that living on the slope, in a sloped house on the interior would make you live forever. Right, so it's kind of the extreme version of Virilio and Parent's idea that this would actually improve your life, right? Like you wouldn't clutter your life with things that you don't need. You would be more socially engaged because you wouldn't be cocooned in the comfort of your home, and all of these things. So I think that there was a hope that the impact would be positive, but I think kind of setting it up as a research project, I think, is some evidence of their uncertainty which way that evidence would go.
Hi, Igor.
Hi, Scott.
My question's kind of a son of Frankenstein, granddaughter of Frankenstein question. It seems to me that there's a trajectory to this work that gets embedded in the work of people like Peter Eisenman and Rem Koolhaas, and like there is a trajectory of work that is actually impacted by this work. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious as to what you might do with that.
So, as I briefly mentioned earlier in the lecture, in the 1990s, there was a very specific kind of revival of this work. Frédéric Migourou, the French curator, kind of staged the rediscovery of this work and placed it in relation to the kind of younger, at that time, kind of emerging architects. One of the people who have been really helpful along this project, for example, is the French architect Odile Deck, who I've worked with a lot and who actually was very nice to write a blurb for the back of the book. And Frédéric Migourou hired or commissioned her to do the exhibition in the French Pavilion in 1996 featuring Claude Parent's work along with Jean Nouvel and all these other people. And so I think for a long time now, for about 30 years, there has been this kind of clarity and in some ways a kind of a retroactive homage to this work as a kind of, and its connection to this kind of, let's say, not only digital formalism, but also digital formalism. So I think a lot of people have already acknowledged that. I mean, when Joseph Giovannini wrote Claude Parent's obituary when he died in October of in 2016, and Frank Gehry talks about his work, and Greg Lynn talks about this work, and it seems like somehow all these people, if they didn't know the work at the time, they learned about it and were attracted to it because of this kind of affinity. And it's not only formal. I think, the idea of emergence is a contemporary interest that is not only a formal concern. So I felt like that work had been done by others, and certainly, I studied with Lee Saint-Couture and Hani Rashid when Claude Parent came to Columbia in the 90s. They were some of the only people, aside from Bernard Tchoumi, who spoke French, so they spent a lot of time with him. Claude Parent didn't speak English. It's a part of the reason why people don't know about him, because he did not engage outside of France in the way that, for example, Paul Virilio did and many of his contemporaries. One of his first employees, right after Virilio and Parent split up, but they had some other commissions, one of Parent's first employees was Jean Nouvel. Jean Nouvel worked on his projects, and in fact, the kind of the roofscape of the Paris Philharmonic at Parc de la Villette is a kind of homage to Parent as a kind of walkable roof that takes you from the top of the building all the way back into the park. So I felt like those connections had already been made, and what I was interested in was suggesting alternative connections to this work that didn't have to do as explicitly with form.
Just one comment about that. I guess part of what I wanted to know was how did the people we just talked about theorize that shift, or that the shift to a kind of continuous platform, or a way of thinking about things that were oblique without saying the oblique.
Yeah.
How did they justify, or did that have
I think
have
it
an
depends on
effect
who you're
that?
talking about. I think if you talk about Sejima's Rolex Center, I think the theoretical underpinnings are going to be very different from, let's say, Eisenman's, who might have thought of it in terms of like archaeology. I mean, I don't think Peter Eisenman was interested in Claude Parent, but I think you could find. So I don't think that would be kind of a singular thing. I think a part of the reason why I was interested in reinterpreting obliqueness beyond form is that, like, the oblique surface at the scale of the interior is kind of dead on arrival. A part of the reason why he was able to experiment with these surfaces inside cultural centers is because they had the scale that allowed you. I mean, we all know how hard ramps are. They're always much longer than you think they're going to be. And so it's kind of a non-starter. I mean, Claude Parent built a lot, but he never got to do oblique housing. And I think that it's kind of an impossible project, because you can imagine the kind of the slope at the scale of landscape, or even at the scale of building, doesn't really work as an interior condition. And so these experiments, I think, were a way of kind of broadcasting a kind of ethos or a sense of possibility, but they were not surfaces for living in the way that he was drawing them, and so yeah, and and he's, when it's sort of at the end of his life, he acknowledged the kind of the success of buildings like Snøhetta's Oslo Opera House. And then he said, but it's not really oblique because there's no program, because it's all circulation. So anyway, I think that this was like the kind of what is the oblique thing is kind of a maybe a little bit of a unicorn. But I thought that it had as a kind of ethos and a way of working, and in particular as a kind of modeled after the tour and the kind of the series of experiments, that it had other productive implications for design practice.
Okay, we really have to wrap up. We can have like a really extremely short question if anyone can make one. Otherwise, is it short? Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.